The landscape stretched out before me, an endless expanse of flat, dry fields and scrubland dotted with the occasional abandoned farmhouse. I'd been driving for hours, maybe longer, on a highway that felt like it might go on forever. My GPS had stopped giving directions somewhere back on the interstate, and now it was stuck on a permanent, recalculating message. I should have been worried, but part of me wasn't. I was tired, frustrated, and eager to make it to my destination. A new city, a new job, a fresh start. The last few years had been a blur of dead-end gigs, broken relationships, and a nagging sense that I was running out of time. So when the job offer came, it felt like a lifeline, something to grab onto before I slipped further down the path of stagnation. The position was good, the pay better, and the opportunity to put distance between myself and everything I wanted to leave behind was too tempting to pass up. But somewhere between the city I was leaving and the one I was heading to, I had taken a wrong turn. At first, I'd been too stubborn to admit it, too convinced I could find my way back to the main road without stopping to ask for directions. Then the road started narrowing, winding through endless stretches of wilderness with no signs, no other cars, and no landmarks I recognized. My fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and a sense of dread began creeping in, gnawing at the back of my mind. I hadn't seen a town in miles, no sign of civilization at all, until the trees began to thin out, and I saw it, an old faded sign on the side of the road. It was so worn that the paint had all but peeled away, leaving behind only ghostly traces of letters. Still, I could just barely make out the word "welcome" at the top, and something about a population below. But there was no town name. I slowed the car, peering ahead at the narrow road that led off into the distance. A sense of relief washed over me, mingling with the growing unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Maybe this town wasn't on any map, but it was there, and right now, that was enough. I took the turn, my tires crunching over loose gravel as I followed the road into a thick canopy of trees. The further I drove, the darker it became, the sunlight filtering through the dense branches in thin, jagged rays. My headlights clicked on automatically as I entered the shadowy tunnel, casting long, shifting shadows along the narrow road. After about a mile, the trees opened up, and I saw it, the town. It sat nestled in a shallow valley, rows of small houses lining the main street, their windows dark and their paint chipped and peeling. The town had an air of abandonment, like a place left behind by time. A few of the houses looked lived in, though, porches swept clean, curtains drawn in the windows. But there were no people, no cars, just a strange, eerie stillness that settled over everything like a blanket. I drove slowly down the main street, scanning for signs of life. The only sound was the low hum of my engine and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. It felt as though I had stumbled into another world, a place untouched by the modern age. At the center of town, I spotted what I was looking for, a small gas station with a single pump out front. The building itself was old, the paint faded and cracked, but the neon sign in the window flickered faintly. Open. I parked beside the pump and got out of the car, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. As I stepped toward the station, the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic filled the air. It was an odd smell, but I brushed it off. My main concern was getting fuel and maybe asking someone for directions. The bell over the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves of dusty snacks and faded soda bottles. Behind the counter sat an old man, his skin pale and his eyes wide, almost too wide as he stared at me. He didn't say a word, just watched me with an unnerving intensity. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. I need to fill up. Can you help me?" The old man blinked slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window. "Help yourself," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked, like it hadn't been used in a while. "But you best be quick. Night's coming." I frowned, glancing outside. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the deserted street. Is there something I should know about? The old man's eyes flicked back to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in them. Fear, maybe, but he didn't answer. Instead, he just sat there, his bony fingers tapping slowly on the counter. I didn't press him. Something about this place was setting my nerves on edge, and I didn't want to linger any longer than I had to. I quickly paid for the gas, then stepped back outside to fill up my tank. As the fuel flowed into the car, I glanced around the town again, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There was something wrong here, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had expected the quiet, maybe even the desolation, but the air itself felt heavy, almost oppressive, like the town was holding its breath. I finished fueling up and was about to get back into the car when I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was a low, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under pressure. I turned toward the sound, scanning the street for the source, but saw nothing. No people, no movement, just the empty street and the rows of dark houses. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from one of the houses just across the street. The front door, which had been closed when I arrived, was now slowly swinging open, as if pushed by an unseen hand. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything, to emerge from the darkness inside. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked shut again, the sound echoing through the still air. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to get in the car and drive as far away from this place as possible, but another part of me, the part that still clung to logic, told me it was just the wind. I forced myself to breathe, shaking off the creeping unease that had settled over me. I was just tired. Lost and tired. I needed to find somewhere to rest for the night, then figure out where I was in the morning. I got back into the car and drove further into the town, my eyes scanning for any sign of a motel or inn. The streets were narrow and winding, lined with more of the same dilapidated houses and overgrown lawns. Here and there I spotted glimpses of movement, curtains twitching in windows, shadows shifting behind cracked glass, but I never saw anyone. Finally, at the far end of the main road, I found what I was looking for, a small two-story building with a faded sign that read Evergreen Motel. The parking lot was empty except for a single rusted pickup truck, and the windows of the building were dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the office, the only sign of life I'd seen so far. I parked and made my way to the office, the sound of my footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, cramped room with a desk and a row of keys hanging on the wall. Behind the desk sat a woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun and her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just passing through. Need a place to crash for the night." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as if she were trying to decide something. Finally, she nodded and reached for one of the keys behind her. "Room 6, she said, sliding the key across the counter. "End of the hall." I thanked her and took the key, feeling her eyes on me as I turned and headed for the hallway. The motel was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled in places, revealing the bare wood beneath. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the floor creaked under my feet as I made my way to the room. Room 6 was small and simple, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a small TV mounted on the wall. The window looked out onto the empty parking lot, and the curtains were drawn tightly shut. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down, letting out a long breath. The weight of the day was finally catching up to me, and all I wanted to do was sleep. But as I lay down, something kept nagging at the back of my mind. The old man's warning about nightfall, the strange sound of that door creaking open, the unsettling stillness of the town. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The night fell quickly, bringing with it a suffocating silence that wrapped itself around the town like a thick blanket. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and whispering through the trees, but that wasn't what was bothering me. It was the quiet. There were no cars, no distant hum of traffic, no animals rustling in the bushes. It was as if the town had been cut off from the world, existing in its own eerie bubble of silence. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a small town. Maybe it had been forgotten by time. Maybe the people here were different, but that didn't mean something sinister was happening. I was drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep when I heard it again. The faint, rhythmic creaking of wood. This time, it was louder, closer, like it was coming from just outside my window. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding in my chest. I lay still, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It was the same creaking I'd heard earlier, the sound of a door slowly opening and closing. But this time, there was no wind to explain it. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was deliberately pushing the door open, inch by inch. I sat up, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My eyes flicked toward the window, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching me through the glass. But the curtains were drawn, hiding whatever might be lurking outside. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The screen glowed weakly in the darkness, casting a faint beam of light across the room. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing as I debated whether to pull back the curtains. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. My hand shook as I reached for the edge of the curtain, slowly pulling it back just a fraction of an inch. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing just beyond the window, was a figure. The figure was tall and indistinct, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light seeping through the gaps in the curtains. It stood perfectly still, just a shadow at the edge of the window, as though it had materialized out of the night itself. My heart thudded in my chest, and my breath became shallow, caught in my throat as I stared at the motionless form. For a moment, I was frozen, too scared to pull back the curtains further, too terrified to close them. I blinked, wondering if I was imagining it, if my mind had finally cracked under the pressure of the long drive, the isolation, and the eerie emptiness of the town. But no matter how much I willed it to disappear, the figure remained. The creaking stopped, silence settled over the room again, oppressive and thick. I could hear nothing but the thumping of my own heartbeat in my ears. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. I yanked the curtain shut with a gasp, stumbling back from the window, my hands shaking. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I had to leave, but as I reached for my shoes, something stopped me. The words of the old man from the gas station echoed in my head. "Best be quick, night's coming." And the woman at the motel, her eyes narrowing as she handed me the key, as if she knew something I didn't. What had she said? Something about nightfall? I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get in the car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But what if they were right? What if it wasn't safe out there after dark? I hesitated. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some late-night passerby, someone as lost as I was. Maybe I was just too wound up after all the strange events of the day. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had taken root deep inside me. I took a deep breath and moved cautiously toward the door. I couldn't just stay in here, waiting for something to happen. I needed to at least check if anyone else was awake, maybe get some answers from the woman at the front desk. She had to know something. I pulled the door open slowly, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The air felt even colder out here, the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. The lights flickered weakly, casting strange, shifting shadows along the walls. My footsteps were almost too loud in the silence, the creak of the old floorboards sending shivers up my spine. I made my way down the narrow corridor, my eyes darting to each closed door as I passed. The motel was still as a tomb. There were no sounds of people moving, no distant voices, no TV blaring from behind any of the doors. It was as though I were the only one here, alone in this crumbling relic of a building. When I reached the front desk, the woman from earlier was gone. The chair where she'd been sitting was empty, and the small office behind the counter was dark. I peered inside, my hand hovering over the bell on the desk, but I didn't ring it. Something told me not to make noise. That same strange feeling that I was being watched had followed me down the hall, crawling over my skin like 1,000 tiny insects. I turned and glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened. Where had the woman gone? And why had the town been so deserted when I arrived? These questions spun in my head as I searched for something, anything that would help me understand what was happening. I was about to head back to my room when I heard it again, the faint creaking of wood. But this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from further down the hall, from somewhere deeper inside the motel. My stomach twisted into knots and my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor, but something compelled me to follow the sound, some instinctual need to understand what was going on. I moved quietly, my breath catching in my throat with every step. The creaking grew louder as I approached a door at the very end of the hall. Room 9. The number had been scratched into the wood, and the doorknob was worn and tarnished. The door itself was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if moved by an invisible hand. I reached out, hesitating only a second before pushing the door open. The room inside was dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. It looked like all the other rooms. A small bed, a dresser, a window with curtains drawn tight, but there was something off. The air was colder here, so cold I could see my breath. And that smell, the faint metallic scent, was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the space for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. Something glinting in the light, lying on the floor near the foot of the bed. A key. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was old, worn, like the kind of key you'd expect to see in some antique lock. But what unsettled me most was the small metal tag attached to it. It was stamped with a single number, 9. This was the key to room 9, but the door had already been unlocked when I arrived. I stood up, clutching the key tightly in my hand, my mind racing. Something about this room, this whole town was wrong. Very wrong. I needed to leave, now. As I turned to head back into the hallway, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lamp flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened. The creaking had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, like someone speaking just on the edge of hearing. It was coming from the far corner of the room, from the shadows near the window. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was soft, almost pleading. My stomach churned as I strained to listen, my eyes wide in the darkness. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like a woman's voice, but it was distorted, like it was coming from a great distance, or through water. I backed up toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, but it was ice cold, and when I twisted it, the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the wood felt thick and solid beneath my fists. The whispering continued, growing louder and more frenzied, the words tumbling over each other in a jumbled, incoherent rush. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room was silent again, but the oppressive feeling remained, pressing down on me like a weight. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing in the corner of the room, its tall, thin frame barely visible in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't outside the window, it was inside, with me. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was testing the air around it. I couldn't make out any details, just the faint outline of a face obscured by shadow, and eyes that seemed to glint in the darkness. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the door, my mind racing for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room, and the air grew colder still, the metallic scent overwhelming. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's hand reached toward me, long and thin, its fingers outstretched, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to make it out of this room. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But then, just as the figure's fingers brushed against my skin, the door behind me flew open, and I tumbled backward into the hallway. The lights flickered on again, and the cold air disappeared, replaced by the familiar musty smell of the motel. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for breath, and looked around. The figure was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. My hands were still trembling, my legs weak, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to leave. Now. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my hands fumbling with the keys as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored the gas, speeding out of the parking lot and back onto the main road. The town passed by in a blur, the empty streets and dark houses fading into the distance as I raced toward the highway. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles away, far from the town, that I allowed myself to breathe again. The tightness in my chest eased, but the fear remained, lingering at the edges of my mind like a shadow. I didn't know what had happened in that room or what I had seen, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Not to that town. Not to that motel. And as I drove down the dark highway, the lights of the town disappearing in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something that had come from that place. Something that was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night, and I don't think I ever will again. Months later, after settling into the new city and trying to move on from that night, I found myself searching for the town on a map. I don't know why. Curiosity maybe, or the lingering need for closure. But no matter how hard I looked, no matter how many maps I scoured, I couldn't find it. It was as if the town had never existed. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it again, the faint rhythmic creaking of wood just outside my window.